I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as President Donald Trump says the US may provide air support to back a Ukraine peace deal, we assess reports that as many as 10 European countries are considering putting boots on the ground if Russia agrees to end its war. Then we take a step back and try to make sense of the historic past few days. What, if anything, has changed?
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We are strong. We are Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 20th of August, 3 years and 179 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls. Later, you'll hear a dispatch Adelie recorded in Ukraine at the funeral of journalist Victoria Roshchyna. But first, over to Dom for the latest from the front lines.
Well, thanks, Francis. Hello, everyone. Let's go into the Donbass, or into eastern Ukraine more broadly. Not a huge amount of movement on the front lines, a few bits here and there. Russia seems to be trying to mass forces and try pushing towards Sloviansk. The situation a little bit further south in the vicinity of Dobropia. It wasn't quite a thrust, but that push north of Pokrovsk a couple of weeks ago. That is still confusing. There are reports of Ukrainian counterattacks and Russian counterattacks, so it's all very fluid. Russia has not continued to advance in that area or eject Ukrainian forces pushing in to counterattack, but equally, Ukraine hasn't completely ejected them from there. Now, the Institute for the Study of War says that both Russian and Ukrainian forces in the area have very low manpower density levels, i.e. there's a lot of land and not a lot of soldiers, and the terrain there consists of wide open fields with very few buildings. So all these factors favour, well, they might favour kind of rapid tactical gains, literally just running from tree line to tree line, or small buildings, small bits of cover, one to the other. But that doesn't necessarily build into some bigger operational manoeuvre or even tactical, really, if it's individuals largely sort of rushing to get to seek the cover they can. So very confusing, but very fluid. Now, it suggests a lot of movement. I think it's quite interesting. We've not seen a lot of reports or not heard a lot of reports about drones either having a great effect for either side if they are indeed operating, which perhaps indicates their limitations in a very fluid, a very mobile battle. Yeah, we've mentioned this before about the impact of drones, but we've made the point that it's very positional, very static, largely, the contact line in eastern Ukraine, well, the whole of Ukraine, actually, for at least the last 18 months or so. This is the first time there's been any kind of, well, more movement. So we are used to drones flying up and down a fairly static line looking for targets. That they probably are still operating in this area. But trying to work out friend from foe when it's a very mobile battle is tricky. And also, of course, don't forget that the operators themselves are probably having to move so as not to be targeted themselves. Now, generally, when we see pictures of drones, we see the operators sitting still with the goggles on. I doubt it's very easy to control drones if you're bouncing around them in the back of a vehicle as you change positions. And I would further imagine that fibre optic drones can't be operated when the operator is moving. The great advantage, of course, of fibre optic drones is that it's a fixed line which can't be jammed. It spools out the back of the drone itself, so it doesn't snag on trees and buildings. It sort of lays on top of them, but the drone is never pulling the fibre optic cable, so it's not under any tension. But if the operator is also moving, jumped in the back of a vehicle or back of a pickup truck, changing position, they will be dragging the line, which could then easily snap, I would imagine. So that may account for why we've not seen so many drone shots of what's going on at the moment in that area. But obviously, we will continue to keep our eyes on it. Now, elsewhere, according to Ukraine's Air Force, Russian forces overnight launched 93 Shahed-type attack and decoy drones, along with 2 Iskander-M ballistic missiles. At least 62 drones and one of the missiles were intercepted. The remaining munitions hit 20 locations across the country. In Sumy Oblast, Russian troops fired more than 140 times on 52 settlements there, authorities report. And a Russian drone strike on the northeastern city of Oktyabr in Sumy Oblast left 14 injured, including 3 children, local authorities said this morning. In the central Dnipropetrovsk region, Russian forces killed 1 person, injured more, and there were 2 civilians killed in Donetsk and Kharkiv regions. Now, Ombre Intelligence, the global maritime risk management firm, they flagged something. A Panama-flagged chemical tanker was reportedly struck in an attack carried out by Russian forces whilst the vessel was moored at the port of Izmail in Ukraine, down on the river border with Romania. According to Russian forces-affiliated media, the drone attack directly targeted the chemical tanker as well as port facilities and oil storage vessels there. The ship was thought to have suffered extensive damage to the starboard superstructure and was disabled. According to the AIS data, the kind of location data the ships give off so that folks know where they are and don't bang into them, the vessel arrived at Izmail early afternoon yesterday, and the last broadcast by the AIS system was received in the early hours of today. Ombre Intelligence observed, they say they've seen uncorroborated footage after the strike showing columns of smoke and fire with extensive damage to the port facilities there. Reportedly, up to 20 drones were fired at the port. Izmail District State Administration confirmed the strikes on the port, but didn't comment on anything about the vessel. And that's all I've seen on that, so not able to corroborate the information there. Now, elsewhere last night, an unidentified object, which I've seen other reports unverified saying it was a Shahed drone, but an unidentified object fell into a cornfield and exploded overnight in eastern Poland, near Lublin, down near the border. Polish police said this morning. The blast is said to have shattered windows in several homes, although no one was injured. Police officers found burnt metal and plastic debris at the site. They say air raid sirens were sounding for about an hour, just over the border at the time in Ukraine's Volyn and Lviv regions, from 10 o'clock local, or early hours of the morning local last night. But the governors there reported no air attacks, so it may have been something that was going for them that ended up going into Poland. The Polish army said there was no violation of Polish airspace recorded last night from either Ukraine or Belarus. Marek Jovic, who's the police spokesman, said, "We are trying to establish what the object could be. Police and firefighters are on the scene." So all rather mysterious. Next one, the Kharkiv Oblast Prosecutor's Office said yesterday it's opened an investigation into a Russian soldier of the 82nd Motorized Rifle Regiment who is said to have participated in the executions of 2 Ukrainian prisoners of war in Vovchansk in June and July last year. So Vovchansk is that lodgement north of Kharkiv city, that area that Russia has pushed into, well, over a year ago now, but not gone any further. The Russian soldier was captured on September the 24th when the Vovchansk aggregate plant, which is said to be the location of the murders, was retaken by Ukraine. He reportedly told investigators that a Russian commander had ordered the execution of Ukrainian prisoners of war. ISW says there has been a sharp increase in credible reports and footage of Russian forces executing Ukrainian prisoners of war last year and 2025 so far. Their assessment continues to be that Russian military commanders are either complicit in or directly enabling their subordinates to conduct systemic executions, obviously in direct violation of international law. A couple more from me. The former Ukrainian soldier goes by the name Tatragami on Twitter, well-connected if slightly mysterious open source intelligence analyst, says, albeit with a lot of caveats, that it says it's very difficult to confirm much of the reporting, but says that last Saturday a Russian general sustained injuries in Kursk Oblast, resulting in the individual losing an arm and a leg. Those injuries were later confirmed by the head of Dagestan, bizarrely. Now, a video said to be of the attack on a vehicle column that the general was travelling in was published on the Ukrainian Telegram channel Operativno ZSU. And based on reports from Ukrainian military intelligence, the HUR, they were saying that they conducted an overnight attack Saturday, Sunday on a convoy in the Kursk region. That's thought to be the attack that wounded Lieutenant General Abachev. Was the deputy commander of the Russian Sever grouping. We're told he was evacuated to Moscow, where 2 limbs were amputated. This attack, we think, occurred just north of Rilsk. That's near the area where Ukraine pushed into Kursk Oblast August last year. Rilsk was the town just to the north of Sudzha. And we think it's about, well, the nearest point to Ukraine is 20 miles. It's 20 miles from Ukraine, so quite a strike. No other details known. And as I say, some caveats there on what we can and can't verify. But I looked at that and I thought, well, how did the HUR know the timings of the convoy, the specific vehicle that General Abashev is supposed to have been in, and how are they able to operate drones that far inside Kursk anyway? All points, I think, to a pretty slick operation or just good luck. I think I know which one I'll go for there. And finally for me, Francis, NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte was in Turkey yesterday speaking to President Erdogan about peace talks between Ukraine and Russia and Turkey's role in Black Sea security. Afterwards, in a statement, President Erdogan's office said the call addressed the latest developments concerning the peace process between Ukraine and Russia. President Erdogan and NATO Secretary-General Rutte highlighted Turkey's key role in the Ukraine peace process and the security of the Black Sea. Now, I saw the report, first of all, in the Kyiv Independent. They note that Ankara has remained one of the few countries maintaining direct contact with both Kyiv and Moscow since the start of the full-scale invasion, and has previously hosted negotiations between the sides, those negotiations that, quick as a flash, went nowhere. Turkey also, you'll remember, controls the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, making it the only NATO member able to restrict naval access to the Black Sea. That's under the, what's it called?
You're talking about the Montreux Convention?
The Montreux Convention, that's it. Yeah, thank you. The Montreux Convention. Now, just to say, Mark Rutte, NATO Secretary-General, he's going to be the keynote speaker at the International Institute for Strategic Studies Prague Defence Summit that's coming up, taking place early September. And I will be there, like last year, if only to try to use my selfie stick on Petropavl. But that's us up to date, Francis.
Well, I'm sure he would love that. Thanks, Dom. Ukraine, the latest very own Nostradamus, predicting Putin would invite Zelensky to Moscow for that bilateral meeting. And that is exactly what has happened. Apparently, during that call with President Trump on Monday, it was the venue that was put forward by Putin. But Zelensky understandably said no in response for all the reasons we discussed yesterday, not just for the optics, which would be entirely under the Kremlin's control were it to take place there, but also safety. Remember that there were multiple assassination attempts on the Ukrainian president, believed orchestrated by Moscow in the past. Now, we mentioned yesterday that other venues are being put forward by Ukraine's allies. Geneva, Switzerland, is a front runner, though the White House is allegedly considering Budapest, Hungary's capital, as a possibility for the trilateral meeting with Trump and the Russian and Ukrainian leaders following their one-on-one talks if they go well. Now, Donald Tusk of Poland has raised objections for reasons that will be very familiar to listeners. He wrote this morning, Budapest. Not everyone may remember this, but in 1994, Ukraine already got assurances of territorial integrity from the US, Russia and the UK in Budapest. Maybe I'm so superstitious, but this time I would try to find another place. Things continue to move at pace more broadly in the diplomatic realm. About 10 European countries are ready to send forces to Ukraine as part of security guarantees for the country following any peace deal, according to reports. Yesterday, European officials fleshed out the plan to send a multinational reassurance force to deter future Russian aggression and now await Trump's approval, according to Bloomberg, citing people familiar with the matter. The first stage, apparently, would include European troops, including hundreds of British and French soldiers, being stationed in Ukraine away from the front line to help its military with training and reinforcements. A later stage of the plan calls for a US backstop to contribute to intelligence sharing, border surveillance, weapons supplies, and possibly air defence. Hold that thought. The overall size and role of the European force, it's still unclear, to be honest, but details are expected to be agreed, crucially, in the coming days. The extent of US assistance remains murky, but at a minimum, European officials expect Washington to provide intelligence and weaponry through European partners. In a potential breakthrough, Trump suggested yesterday that the US Air Force is prepared to police the skies above Ukraine to ensure peace. American air support would be likely to include planes and missiles launched from neighbouring countries. Clearly, major discussions are taking place at the moment, unlike any that we have seen before now. Those military chiefs sent to Washington we mentioned yesterday, including Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, the British Chief of the Defence Staff, are clearly pushing things forward as the two leaders co-chaired that Coalition of the Willing meeting of more than 30 leaders, including those of Japan, Canada and New Zealand. A Downing Street spokesperson said that the Prime Minister outlined that Coalition of the Willing planning teams would meet with their US counterparts in the coming days to further strengthen plans to deliver robust security guarantees. Finland's Foreign Minister said the Allies had agreed to start work on a framework for those guarantees. And a European source said defence officials are now working on concrete security guarantees. We will see them in a week. Now, NATO military chiefs are also set to iron out the details of a future security guarantee for Ukraine in a virtual meeting between military chiefs from the alliance's 32 member states that is taking place literally as we speak. And we understand that a Black Sea naval task force is also being considered to help demine that area and secure shipping routes. At the same time, the Telegraph understands that the UK and EU are preparing new sanctions on Russia, which could be triggered if Putin refuses to attend three-way talks. A senior government source said if Putin was to delay, prevaricate or refuse to talk, that would provide another impetus for sanctions. And those same sources said that Putin only agreed to meet Trump in Alaska after the US president hit India with sanctions for continuing to buy cheap Russian oil. Now, just a comment on that, I personally think, and I think we would agree in this room at least, that it's unlikely sanctions were the cause for that meeting. That was a major win for Putin, and I think he would have accepted it regardless, frankly, once that offer was on the table. Now, as James Kilner spoke about on the podcast yesterday, there are signals in Kremlin comms that they are not ruling out a meeting with Zelensky. But Foreign Minister Lavrov continues to play bad cop, arguing that talks would have to be prepared extremely carefully, his words, and would require step-by-step gradual preparation, starting with the expert level and thereafter going through all the required steps, his words. In an interview with Fox and Friends yesterday, Trump said he was keen to keep up the momentum, though, claiming one of the European leaders in that meeting on Monday suggested meeting for another round of talks at the White House in a month or two. To which Trump said he replied, "A month or two? You're going to have another 40,000 people dead in a month or two. You have to do it tonight." And I did. I called President Putin and we're trying to work out a meeting with President Zelensky. If it works out, I'll go to the Trilat and close it up. Now, Trump also tied his push for peace to a personal spiritual goal. He said, if I can save 7,000 people a week from being killed, I think that's I want to try to get to heaven if possible. I'm hearing that I'm not doing well. I hear I'm really at the bottom of the totem pole. At times it really is hard not to see Trump as some kind of medieval monarch almost. Anyway, remarkably, after his call with Putin, Trump also reportedly telephoned Viktor Orban, Hungary's prime minister, to ask in part why he was blocking Ukraine's accession to the European Union after being urged to do so by European leaders. We don't know anything more, but if that is true, very interesting indeed. So for the optimists, those who believe Trump can be won round, that shift on air support is significant. But there's always room for the pessimists too. Trump has just revoked security clearances for 37 current and former national security officials, many of whom worked on Russia analysis or foreign threats to US elections, according to Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard. At least 3 current senior officials at various intelligence agencies, all with reputations for non-partisan work, are among those who lost their clearances and their jobs. They included Shelby Pearson, a senior intelligence official who warned Congress about Russian meddling in the 2020 election. For those who missed yesterday's episode with James Kilner, we recommend it. as all of these speculations depend on Russia's military, economic and strategic position, and whether they would be willing to accept some of these proposals without more pressure being applied. Roland has just written a very interesting piece underscoring the numbers that show Russia is years from victory. Again, 4.4 years being the time it would take Moscow's forces to capture the remainder of territory that Russia has annexed, according to the British Ministry of Defence assessment. 1% being the amount of Ukraine's land taken by Russian troops in the past 1,000 days. 1.9 million, the number of additional casualties Russia would need to suffer to achieve Putin's goals. 0.9%, the International Monetary Fund's 2025 growth estimate for Russia, down from an initial 1.5% forecast made in April. And 26, the number of months it took Russian troops to advance 6.8 miles in Donetsk, from western Bakhmut to the western edge of Chasiv Yar. But despite all that, do they still believe the gamble, and it is a gamble, to continue fighting is worth it? That remains a critical question. So Dom, let's leave the updates behind now, take in a long breath after what has been a manic few days, and look at that question and some of the other key questions of the moment. Let's start with that one. How serious do we think Russia is about peace? There are some senior figures who are saying that they believe Russia is quite serious now about going to the table, given the indications we've seen over the past few days. Do you agree with that? Do you think Russia can stop and wants to stop?
Well, it can stop. I don't think Russia wants to stop at all. I don't see any sign that they're at all interested in peace or a ceasefire or anything as we would understand it in that way. I mean, yes, certainly they want peace on their terms. They want peace having subjugated the whole country. They might accept some sort of peace now so they could take a breather and come back in a few years' time. But generally, in terms of actually stopping, no, they're not at all. Putin believes his tail is up in the Donbass. He's happy with the tiny incremental gains that they are making. He's content at the casualty rates that is drawing. What he is worried about, though, or seems to be, is these continued long-range Ukrainian drone attacks on energy infrastructure. We see the price of fuel going up in Russia. There are images today of huge lines at petrol stations. James Kilner spoke yesterday about the internet blackouts across much of the country because Russia thinks that's in some way going to interfere with the guidance system that Ukraine is using. So long-range strikes are having some kind of effect. So if there's any negotiation now, and it would all be just for future advantage, which I know is what negotiation is. You work to maximise your advantage, but what I mean is they're thinking this is not the end of it, it's just the end of this phase. So if there's any negotiation at all, the only possible thing they might come to the table with, which they would make a right old song and dance about, this massive concession, would be aerial strikes. So Russia at the moment is hitting Ukrainian cities nightly. That's doing nothing for their cause. It's not advancing the line in any way. It's not breaking the will of the people to resist Russia's aggression. So the aerial strikes are just performative violence. It's what they know. It's all they can do. They've got no other answer. So it doesn't actually cost them anything to stop that. If they can get Ukraine to stop the long-range strikes inside Russia in return, that would be something they would prize. So I would expect to see that coming back. If they are forced any closer, and it would take Donald Trump to do this, but if this bilateral or the trilat is going to happen, then I think an aerial ceasefire, probably limited by 30 days or something like that, would be the only thing they might come to the table with. But short answer to your question, they are not interested in stopping at all.
I'm inclined to agree, I have to say, and it's interesting seeing the mood music shift on this, because I say there have been certain figures, I won't name them, who privately have been saying it just feels like Russia are serious about potentially trying to stop here. But I think that, and we'll come to this in a moment, it will depend entirely on the terms, as you allude to, Dom. And I think the other key question here is, can Russia stop? You know, the war economy being as it is, the way that the country has become increasingly fascistic, to use that term I've used again and again, history would suggest it's very difficult to turn this off very easily. Now, a counter-argument to that would be that because of the pressures being as they are, because of the realism which Putin is known to have displayed at various different phases of his long dictatorship, that they will take the risk to turn off, because there are risks inherent in turning off the taps of war as well. The hundreds of thousands of soldiers potentially returning to Russia, that has risks, as we know from history, as well as potential economic implications. But that they might say, look, we cannot continue to fight this war indefinitely at this current level, and thereby it is still worth us trying to find some kind of agreement that will allow us to still claim victory, whereas while not getting all of our main and critical objectives that we sought to achieve. But I think it is worth us, again, just underscoring the fact that when we look at Putin's core goals for the war, he's nowhere near them. And there would still be evidence to believe that he has no intention of stopping until Ukrainian sovereignty has been curtailed, and that its direction of travel towards a more Western-orientated defence posture, as well as economic future and cultural future even, is off the table. So I just keep returning to those points that I know are not new to anybody listening to this, but I think are perhaps getting lost in some of the discussions at the moment. It's just very difficult to see how they would want to stop at the moment. But let's go to the next perhaps question at the moment then, Dom. Will either side agree to the proposals seemingly on the table at this juncture? Let's start with Ukraine, first of all, if there was a freezing at this stage and with some of the discussions that have been going around at the moment.
Well, of course, it's all in the detail. We don't know what the proposal may or may not be. I think, so Ukraine's position at the moment is no territorial concessions. That's the line that Zelensky's held firm to. He kind of has to. I think the big question will be where the line is between de jure and de facto recognition of the occupied territories. So forget the rest of the 4 oblasts in the east that Russia is now trying to get through negotiations. And a slight caveat on that, I think maybe you're right. Maybe they will row back from the extreme military position, just let the ground war carry on, because they seem to be happy with that, and then they'll put their effort into the politics, because it seems as if the direction of travel from the politics at the moment is in their favour, so they might put more effort into that. But I can't see Ukraine in any way agreeing to allow the rest of Donetsk and Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts be taken by Russia, even just the 2 northern ones. But if the line was to freeze where it is, then there would have to be a question over the recognition of those, or what it means, as I say, de facto or de jure, or is that just an academic argument? Because even if it was just de facto recognised that it's a temporarily occupied area, Russia's flooding that place now with engineering works. It's performing defensive positions. It's building up its base. So it's a very tough nut to crack now. The longer they are there, the less likely it is that Ukraine will be able to get that land back. So does Ukraine publicly, they may also already have done so privately, but does Ukraine publicly accept that as just reality on the ground, but use that in some way in any negotiations? It's a very difficult call, because you're consigning huge parts of the country and thousands of people to Russian control. Millions, yes, you're right. So a very difficult decision to take, but I think that's the big one that I'm sure has been doing the circles in Ukraine at the moment.
Do you think the security guarantees that are being mooted at the moment that I was reporting earlier on would be enough to satisfy the Ukrainians? So US air support and then having some bases with some European troops on the ground, is that enough?
I mean, we've got to be careful here. A guarantee is a pretty black or white thing, and I've seen no suggestion of what any of these security guarantees may or may not be to make me think it's absolutely black and white. By black and white, I mean a force that will reassure Ukraine and deter Russia at the same time. Because if it doesn't do the deterrence bit, well, there's no point in doing it. If it literally doesn't deter Russia, then what are you doing there? And if secretly, you can ask the Ukrainians secretly through diplomatic channels, hey mate, are you reassured? And they might say, well, I could do with a bit more of this and a bit more naval and a bit more air, blah, blah, blah. But, you can't turn around to the Russians and say, are you deterred? It's very difficult to make that judgment. But that would need an enormous force, and I'm just not seeing those kind of conversations happen at the moment. But also, we very glibly talk about things like, American air power, that will be there. But what does that mean? What are the rules of engagement of these aircraft? If they are fired at, do they fire back? I guess they would do because that's self-defense. But what about if they see Russians making preparatory moves for increased violence? Does American air power take preemptive military action? So there's all sorts of things, again, in the detail, all around the rules of engagement and what can and can't be done. So just saying, it's okay, America's not going to put boots on the ground, but they'll have jets in the air. To do what, to whom, when, under what conditions? So there's still no detail and a huge number of questions. But ultimately it comes down to, does it reassure Ukraine and does it deter Russia?
I mean, a pessimist would say that we're painting Monday's White House meeting as being a success in some ways, not necessarily us, but I mean we as in many in the political realm and in the media at the moment. But really it just wasn't a total disaster, and that's what counts as victory now. But there weren't any real solid commitments that came out of it. It rather was just preventing the worst case scenarios. And as we've always said, it's deeds, not words. And we have not seen real deeds, real action and real concrete proposals being tabled. And we might not. It might all be behind closed doors until something happens. But nonetheless, it does feel that when decisions are made, they're quite often negative for Ukraine, whilst the talk is always very positive. And another thought that I've had as well is, have we got part of this right and the other part wrong? The wrong bit being that there needs to be pressure on Russia now to make any of this bit even remotely possible for Russia to agree to. To explain what I mean, some of the details that we're seeing are positive. Some of the details that we're seeing are encouraging on the talk of troops potentially on the ground in the case of a peace deal. But without Russia feeling that it has no choice but to agree to circumstances that are on the table at the moment, then in a way you could argue that we are actually disincentivizing at the moment by talking about this, the likelihood of them agreeing to anything. Because they will look at these proposals and think, right, if we agree to peace, we've lost Ukraine. There is no chance that we will ever be able to seize the entirety of the country. We will not be able to have control over its sovereignty and its future. That's a major concession and an admission of defeat for them on certain objectives in this war. So all of this talk about what we will do in the moment of peace being signed is, in that sense, you could argue, is harmful. Because it disincentivizes rather than incentivizes Moscow to go to the table. So it's a very difficult situation at the moment, because you also imagine the alternative scenarios where if European leaders weren't talking seriously about this, that it would just seem that once again we are not doing anything. But I do worry about that. And I suppose that brings me to our next question, Dom, which is what happens if this diplomatic effort collapses?
Well, for Russia, nothing. Nothing. They'll carry on as they are. Like I say, they are content with their progress in the east and the cost that it's taking from them. What happens if this diplomatic effort collapses for Ukraine? Again, there'll be no change, and that no change is a steady, albeit very slow, retreat. I don't like to say that, but that is the reality of what's happening. Unless there's a change in Ukraine's mobilization policy, they get more people in, or there's a huge increase in support from Europe, brackets, and the US, but I think it's pretty clear that the US is not going to. So I think the one thing the one real positive from Monday's meeting was the show of unity from Europe, and that, we've been saying it for ages, that has to happen. They have to get their heads together. They have to put together the coalition of the willing, whatever it's going to be. But they've got to show some more resolve here. And the $100 billion weapons deal that Zelensky said to Trump, that money is from Europe. We've said it for ages. The combined GDP totals of Europe is huge, hugely outweighs Russia. So the money is there. It's the political will that was missing. If we're now going to see political will step up, great, fine. About time. Welcome to the party. And if that is starting to be seen through money to the US just to buy stuff for Ukraine, okay, good. We now need to see this unity when it comes to an actual deterrence or reassurance force, whatever we're going to be calling it. But the long required European unity, did we see the first inklings of it on Monday? I blooming well hope so.
Well, thanks, Tom. All I'd add is that if all of these diplomatic efforts do come to nothing and Europe still doesn't do something to really change the calculus as a result, that in itself will be a humiliation and another victory for Moscow. That's what's at stake now after the events of the last few days. Now, with all of the geopolitical discussions at the moment, it's easy to lose sight of the daily horrors Ukraine is still enduring, including the memorials for loved ones lost in aerial attacks or on the front lines. So we wanted to play you a dispatch Adelie recorded on her trip now. Victoria Roshchyna, the Ukrainian journalist who died in Russian captivity last year, was buried in Kyiv a fortnight ago. She'd been reporting on Russia's systematic policy of extrajudicial detention and torture in the occupied territories before falling victim to those methods herself. She died at the age of 27. Adelie was at the funeral.
So it's Friday, August 8th, and I'm standing in the square in front of St. Mikhail Monastery and Church in the very centre of Kyiv. It's an absolutely gorgeous church that is sky blue with golden domes. It was built in the Kievan Rus almost 1,000 years ago and has been functioning as a place of worship and monastery ever since. It was briefly demolished by the Soviet authorities in the 1930s, and it's been rebuilt after the independence of Ukraine in 1991, and the church was reopened in 1999, so it's very much a symbol of the revival of Ukrainian identity and the continuity of the long history of Ukraine. The churchyard is in the very centre of Kyiv, and it's behind walls with beautiful roses and benches. It's very quiet. But today we're not here for tourism and we're not here for architecture. The churchyard is very quiet and is filling up slowly but very surely with many people, all dressed in black. Everyone is carrying flowers, a lot of them red roses. There's a big line of reporters and photographers because today is the funeral of Victoria Roshchyna. She is the young journalist who went to the occupied territories to investigate Russian war crimes and was murdered by Russian forces. Her body was returned a few months ago, tortured in many different ways, and the funeral is today. So the pallbearers are opening up the car where the coffin is, and people are moving around, crowding around the coffin. As we walk inside the church, we pass underneath wreaths of flowers. Among them, red roses have been placed to show the number 25. That's the age Victoria was when she was kidnapped by Russia before being held hostage for the last 2 years of her life in a Russian jail. The coffin is placed at the centre of the church. At the front, there's a photo of Victoria and several big wreaths, including one made of wheat sheaf, a central symbol of Ukraine's identity. Victoria's father and a younger woman, I imagine maybe her sister, are the only ones sitting down. They're on a small bench alongside the coffin. The rest of us are crowded in a wide circle. Then the funeral starts. On the coffin, there are bouquets of flowers, mostly red roses, and a big loaf of dark bread. It's a tradition in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The bread symbolizes Jesus Christ, which the Gospel calls the bread of life, and the loaf is round to symbolize eternity. And then there are a lot of candles, symbols of life and resurrection, a Christian reminder of hope and light even in the darkest of moments. The crowd is young, and there are a lot of reporters and photographers there. The click of their cameras, a soft buzz over the singing of the choir and of the priests. It's always an odd thing, the funeral of a journalist, where a lot of us are working and mourning at the same time. The lines between the personal and the professional blurred in a continual effort to make sense of things. I can't tell you much about what the priest said in Victoria's eulogy, but what I can tell you is that there's one word that constantly comes back, even if you don't speak Ukrainian.
Журналістики, професію журналістики. Кожен журналіст, слава Ісусу Христу і слава Україні. Героям слава!
After the ceremony, the flock of mourners silently follows the hearse down the hill to Maidan, where the coffin is placed, not far from thousands of Ukrainian flags for the fallen soldiers.
Слава Україні! Слава Вікторії! 3 рази! Слава, слава, слава!
The crowd gathers for more personal eulogies. But first, we kneel.
Сонце зійшло, хай яскраво світить воно, дорого заплачено, ми їх не пробачимо, дорого заплачено, ми їх не пробачимо.
Later, I speak with Natalia Gmenuk. She's the co-founder of Hromadske, one of Ukraine's independent media outlets, and Victoria's former editor. Tell me what Victoria was like as a person.
So she was quite a unique and reckless journalist, but what was special that she was never seeking fame. She was extremely hardworking and was going into the hardest and the least popular stories you can do. She could spend like days in a very, unfortunate court without stop. She would go somewhere to investigate some even like criminal cases, which some people don't understand, because she was always driven by justice. She was reporting and, the detention of the Ukrainian sailors prior to the full-scale invasion, going to Moscow to the court. She couldn't. We are thinking all the time, was it possible if she didn't go? Because in the end she was like freelancer, because it's quite a responsibility for any editorial team for something going that dangerously. But she really truly believed in that. And now I'm thinking it was hardly possible to stop her. Yet what is important, she was detained. She was kept in Russian prison for over the year, and it was very clear she was a journalist. She was a professional journalist, and her health was deteriorating. We learned about that quite at early stage. So she was in poor health, what we know, since December 2023. Allegedly, she died in September 2024. There was always an opportunity for the Russian authorities to free her and to treat her or to do something. So it's a very unfortunate death. We still have other Ukrainian journalists in the Russian detention, so I really think that we should do really more to speak about them. But as about Victoria, you always remember her with a smile, though she was like stubborn and complicated, but truly devoted to her profession. Again, everything she did was not for being famous, was not for being kind of liked. Actually, people were suspicious how she's going there, what is she doing. So, she unfortunately never received any proper gratitude for her work, and that's also extremely painful for me as her former colleague and editor.
Is there a story in particular that stays with you that she's done over the years?
Look, I think that the story about the captivity of the Ukrainian sailors, which was before the full-scale invasion, because, they were in the Russian detention for quite some time. They were caught in the Azov Sea, then brought to Russia. She still at that time risked and went there to the court. And, when they were later freed, we remember very well when there was a live broadcast and there were I don't remember truly what that, over 20 people. She recognized everybody by the name, by the face. She could tell the story of every single person. And it's pretty extraordinary if you see the live footage of some kind of former prisoners coming, because you don't know them, you've never knew them, they're not famous. But for her, that's how she was, that's how she worked.
What happened to her says a lot about what it's like to cover a war, first of all, but also a war against Russia. What stays with you as a journalist, but also with a wider journalistic community in Kyiv?
So for a lot of years, there is a question whether we Ukrainian journalists, why we do not report occupation. And we always say it's impossible. It's impossible. You'll be detained, you'll be killed, you won't. And, it's still kind of, there is sometimes a question raised. After we clearly understood it's impossible, but there are still those people like her. It's not for proving the point, who still say okay, but maybe I'll try because it's our duty, it's our professional duty to do so, so we'll do. But that's what happens, which is really shows a lot about in which condition is our profession. What does it mean to fight against Russia? Because, she died when she was 27. She was tiny, skinny, small girl. What danger she was for them. Why she should be detained. Again, it was clear that she was a journalist. She worked openly, meaning it was not that she was not undercover, but when she was arrested, there was a mission, there was a clarity. So, and for me, what is also extraordinarily painful, she was a freelancer, so already, and we former colleagues, she worked with a number of newsrooms, couldn't kind of take the responsibility for her. But I think it was more than a year ago, I was speaking at almost every biggest journalistic conference and events. UNESCO Press Freedom Day, everywhere, on the top people. So, she became prominent when she was still alive and in detention. Did it help? Unfortunately not. Because we also know that she was tortured. There was an expertise which confirmed that there were some signs of tortures in her body. So why would you do that? There was no need. Of course, there is no need to do that to anybody, but in this particular case, when we clearly know who she is, to keep somebody like without even opportunity to call the family for such long, that tells a lot about whom we're fighting against.
What does justice look like to you?
I'm working on the project on the war crimes documentation, and we speaking to the survivors of the war crimes and speak a lot about justice. I think in my case, it's very simple. You're just doing at least something for somebody to whom we can help. It's very simple. It's like at least doing something which can make some things a bit easier to those who suffer.
Thank you. What do you think it would mean just justice for Victoria in her case?
She is not like me. She would definitely demand all Russian war criminals to be behind the bars, properly punished, all according to the law, because she was very meticulous about the rules of these things. So I think for her that would be this responsibility, but also the world where people like her can do her job.
Українське сонце зійшло, українське сонце зійшло, українське сонце зійшло.
Let's go now to our final thoughts. Dom, where do you want to leave us today?
I'd like to point people to an interesting article posted yesterday on the Covert Shores website by H. Sutton, titled Dance of the Flamingos, Ukraine's FP5 heavy cruise missile. It talks about this new cruise missile, which he says marks an increase in the range and payload of Ukraine's deep strike capability. He says that whilst the sort of kamikaze drone so far can reach up to 2,000 kilometres, this FP5 should be able to go up to 3,000, which will increase the number of strategic targets that Ukraine can hold at threat. Similarly, the warhead is said to be at least 10 times larger than is currently available, which will obviously have much more effect against the energy facilities and drone factories and what have you. This thing apparently made by Ukrainian firm Firepoint. I guess that's where the FP comes from, the FP5 Flamingo. So Firepoint reportedly got a 6-metre wingspan, an estimated length of 14 metres, jet engine on top, and a solid rocket fuel rocket launch booster mounted underneath. It's shot off a rail from a truck, payload of 1,000 kilograms. So, it's big. It looks like, when you look at it, you'll think that looks like a V1 rocket from the Second World War. But as H. Sutton says, assertions about just saying it's a V1, he says, are overly simplistic. He says it owes as much to the V1 as a Tomahawk does. And he continues, generally, the design is what you'd expect for a heavy cruise missile optimised for production and ground launch. We put a link in the episode notes today to that article from H. Sutton, but interesting to see the evolution of long-range strike capability.
Well, thanks, Dom. We're living history at the moment, and given the discussions taking place and the questions about Moscow's approach, it is worth us looking back and reminding ourselves of the key decisions made decades before now and the actions of the Russians in recent years. Filmmaker Benjamin I. Goldhagen, long-time listener to the podcast, has produced a 37-minute film called The Steel Porcupine that records Russia's ruthless campaign in Ukraine and the world's response, using archival footage and original material that also looks much further back. It's free to watch, and we'll add a link to it in the show notes. As we all know, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, and that feels particularly true at the present moment. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom, Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow the Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.